3 million years ago, a primate picked up a rock and smashed it into an animal's skull. That meal, raw and brutal, may have been the reason your brain is large enough to watch this video right now. Meat didn't just feed humanity, it made humanity. And today, we're going to trace that entire journey because the history of meat is, honestly, the history of us. And by the end of this video, you'll see why, for the first time in 3 million years, that relationship might be about to end. Hey, welcome to Object Origins, the channel where we dig into the history of things in a way that actually makes sense. The stuff you use, eat, and take for granted, it all has a story. And today's story might be the biggest one we've ever told. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll go way back, millions of years back, to look at how meat and evolution are linked, and why some researchers believe eating animal protein literally grew our brains. Then we'll jump to the moment humans stopped chasing their food and started farming it, the birth of civilization as we know it. After that, we'll see how meat became a symbol of power, how salted meat built empires, and how Chicago's slaughterhouses quietly invented the modern factory before Henry Ford ever touched an assembly line. And then the present. Billions of animals a year, antibiotics, ecological pressure, and a technology that could change everything. Stay for that last part. It might reshape how you think about the next 50 years. Quick note, some of the evolutionary claims we'll discuss are debated among scientists. I'll flag where the evidence is strong and where it's still being argued. Let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning, and I mean the real beginning. About 2.5 to 3 million years ago, our ancestors, early hominins, were not at the top of any food chain. They were small, they were vulnerable, and their brains were roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. Then something shifted.
Stone tools appeared. Cut marks started showing up on animal bones in the fossil record. And for the first time, these primates had access to dense, calorie-rich animal protein and fat, not just tough roots and fibrous plants. Now here's where it gets fascinating. There's a well-known hypothesis in anthropology, sometimes called the expensive tissue hypothesis, that suggests a direct connection between meat consumption and brain growth. The idea is straightforward. Brains are incredibly expensive organs to run. Your brain right now is burning about 20% of your total energy, even though it's roughly 2% of your body weight. To fuel a bigger brain, you need a richer diet, and meat, calorie-dense, nutrient-dense, packed with fats and proteins, may have been exactly that fuel. Over the next million-plus years, brain size in our lineage roughly tripled. Now, I want to be careful here. This is a hypothesis, not settled fact. Other researchers point to cooking, to tubers, to social cooperation itself as drivers of brain growth. It's almost certainly a combination, but the meat and brain connection remains one of the most compelling ideas in how meat shaped humanity, because it suggests that without animal protein, we might never have developed the cognitive capacity to build language, culture, or civilization at all. That rock smashing into a skull 3 million years ago, it might have been the most important meal in history. But a big brain is only useful if you can organize it, and that's where the next chapter starts. Because hunting didn't just feed individuals. Have you ever thought about what it actually takes to bring down an animal 10 times your size? Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Before agriculture, before cities, before written language, there was the hunt. And the hunt required something revolutionary: cooperation. Early humans weren't fast. They weren't strong compared to the megafauna around them. What they could do was communicate, plan, and work together. Coordinated hunting, driving animals off cliffs, surrounding herds, tracking prey over days using persistence hunting. This wasn't just about food. It was a social technology. It required trust, shared roles, and communication. Some anthropologists argue that the hunting band was the original human community. The first time individuals gave up personal advantage for group benefit. The first time leaders emerged based on skill rather than just size. So when we talk about the history of meat, we're really talking about the origins of human society itself. Meat was the reward, but the hunt was the rehearsal for civilization. And then, about 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Humans figured out they didn't have to chase animals anymore. They could keep them. Roughly 10,000 years ago, give or take a millennium depending on the region, humans in several parts of the world began domesticating animals. Sheep and goats in the Fertile Crescent, cattle in parts of Africa and South Asia, pigs in China and Anatolia. This wasn't sudden, it happened over generations, but the consequences were staggering. This was the history of farming in its earliest form. Once you control your food source, you don't have to move anymore. Settlements become permanent. Populations grow.
Surplus food creates specialization. Suddenly, not everyone has to hunt or gather. Some people can make tools. Some can govern. Some can build. The entire architecture of civilization, from taxation to religion to warfare, traces back, in part, to this moment when humans stopped following animals across the landscape and started penning them in. And here's a detail I find remarkable. This relationship reshaped the animals too. Modern cattle, sheep, and chickens are radically different from their wild ancestors. We bred them for docility, for size, for milk output, for egg production. We didn't just domesticate them, we engineered them across millennia. Meat went from something you risked your life to get to something you owned. And ownership? Ownership created wealth. Which brings us to something you might not expect: meat as a status symbol. In medieval Europe, and honestly in most pre-industrial societies, what you ate told the world exactly who you were. And meat was the dividing line. If you were a king or a noble, your table overflowed with roasted game, whole oxen, elaborate meat pies. Medieval feast records describe dozens of courses, almost entirely animal-based. Venison was often restricted by law. Only the aristocracy could hunt deer in royal forests. Meat meant power, health, and divine favor, at least in the minds of those eating it. Meanwhile, if you were a peasant, your reality was porridge, grain-based stews, maybe a bit of salted pork on a good week. The caloric divide between classes was enormous, and meat sat right at the center of it. This wasn't just about taste or preference, it was political. Control the meat supply, and you control the social hierarchy. This pattern repeats across cultures and centuries, and it's worth remembering, because when we get to the modern era, one of the great promises of industrial farming was to democratize meat, to make what was once a luxury of kings available to everyone. Whether that promise was a good idea, we'll get to that. But first, armies. Because there's a reason the phrase salted meat shows up in every military history ever written. And that reason is simple. You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach. Here's a question. How do you feed 10,000 soldiers marching across a continent, or a navy at sea for 6 months? You can't bring live cattle on every ship. You can't hunt in hostile territory. You need food that lasts. And for most of human history, the answer was salted, dried, and preserved meat. Salted beef and pork, sometimes called salt pork or corned beef, became the backbone of military logistics for centuries. The Roman legions carried preserved meat. The British Royal Navy ran on salt beef and hardtack. Napoleon, the general who allegedly said an army marches on its stomach, invested heavily in food preservation, which eventually led to the invention of canning itself. This might sound like a small logistical detail, but it's not. Preserved meat extended the reach of empires. It allowed armies and fleets to operate at distances that would have been impossible otherwise. Without the ability to keep meat edible for months, the age of exploration, the colonial era, the great naval empires, all of it looks radically different. Meat wasn't just fuel for soldiers, it was a strategic resource that shaped the map of the world. And then came a city that would transform the meat industry history forever. Let me tell you about Chicago. The 1860s, Chicago, Illinois. The railroads have connected the cattle ranches of the American West to the growing cities of the East. And in the Union stockyards, something extraordinary is happening, though extraordinary might not be the word the workers would use. Chicago's meat packers developed what historians call the disassembly line. Carcasses moved along overhead rails, and each worker performed one specific task: one cut, one pull, one separation, before the carcass moved to the next station. It was efficient, it was relentless, and it was revolutionary. Because this system appeared decades before Henry Ford applied the same principle in reverse to build automobiles. Ford himself reportedly visited Chicago's slaughterhouses and took notes. The assembly line that defined the 20th century, it started with meat. But Chicago's packing houses also revealed the darker side of industrial meat. The conditions, for both workers and animals, were brutal. When Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906, describing the filth and exploitation inside those plants, public outrage led to some of the first food safety laws in American history. The factory farming history we know today has its roots right here, in the tension between efficiency and ethics that has never really been resolved. And that tension? it's only gotten bigger. Because what happened next makes Chicago look like a small operation. Today, the global meat industry processes roughly 80 billion animals per year. Let that number sit for a second. 80 billion. That's more than 10 times the entire human population of Earth, every single year. To make this possible, modern factory farming relies on extraordinary levels of industrialization. Animals are bred for maximum growth in minimum time. Chickens reach slaughter weight in about 6 weeks, a timeline that would have been unthinkable even 50 years ago. Antibiotics are widely used, not just to treat disease, but to promote faster growth and prevent infections that spread easily in crowded conditions. Some estimates suggest that a significant majority of all antibiotics produced globally go to livestock, not humans. And the environmental pressure is immense. Livestock farming accounts for a substantial share of greenhouse gas emissions, uses enormous quantities of fresh water, and is a leading driver of deforestation in places like the Amazon basin. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't a simple moral argument. The same system that created these problems also made protein affordable and accessible for billions of people worldwide. The democratization of meat that medieval peasants could never have imagined, it happened. But the cost of that achievement is becoming harder and harder to ignore. So here we are, 3 million years into the relationship between humans and meat. And for the first time ever, a technology exists that could fundamentally change it.
Keep in mind, what I'm about to describe is still early stage, and projections vary widely, but the trajectory is worth paying attention to. Let's step back and see the full arc, because the history of meat really is the history of human civilization compressed into a single thread. It starts with a primate and a rock, raw animal protein possibly fueling the brain expansion that made us who we are. Then the hunt, which taught us cooperation and built the first communities. Then domestication, roughly 10,000 years ago, the moment we stopped following animals and started controlling them, triggering the agricultural revolution and everything that came with it. Meat became power, the dividing line between kings and peasants. Preserved meat became strategy, extending the reach of armies and empires across oceans. Chicago's disassembly lines industrialized processing and accidentally invented the factory age. And now, 80 billion animals a year, ecological strain, and lab-grown meat on the horizon, potentially the biggest disruption since domestication itself. That primate with the rock couldn't have imagined any of this. And honestly, we probably can't fully imagine what comes next. But here's what I do know. Understanding how meat shaped humanity, from brain growth to empire building to the factory floor, gives you a lens to understand almost everything about how we organized our world. And whatever replaces the current system will reshape it just as deeply. Important reminder, many of the evolutionary and historical claims in this video are based on leading research, but science evolves. Always check primary sources if you're diving deeper into any of these topics. If this kind of deep dive into the origins of everyday things is your thing, that's literally what this channel is about. Subscribe to Object Origins so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to keep going right now, I've got another video ready for you. It's right on screen. I'll see you there.